Welcome to Meet, Act, and Part, a Masonic podcast hosted by Midnight Freemasons, Greg Knott, Darin, Todd Vriesen, and Bill Hostler.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Meet, Act, and Part. This is episode 45, and we've titled this The Mature Masculine Friendship. And first, let's introduce ourselves. I'm one of your co-hosts tonight, Greg Knott.
Hi, I'm your other co-host, Darin Laners.
And Bill Hostler is off tonight. He's been getting organized after a move. And so, Bill, if you're listening, hope you're doing well and finish up your move, and you'll be back with us soon. Darin and I were talking about what we wanted to do for a topic for an episode, and I mentioned that he had done a presentation first to Homer Masonic Lodge and later to the Valley of Chicago Scottish Rite, but on a very good topic, and that's the one that we've used for the title of this episode, Mature Masculine Friendship. And what we decided to do is I'm really going to kind of in an interview format talk with Darin and walk through this, the presentation that he did. And because there's so many good topics here that I think are the timeliness of it couldn't have been better on Darin's part to present this. And I think you'll understand more as we go through. Part of it, Darin was talking about core values. We'll get deeper on this, talking about really some of the issues that we're seeing in men today that in many ways have been exacerbated by the last couple of years of COVID, or accelerated in many cases. And he writes this and presents this with a focus of what the fraternity, how it can interact with these things, and he weaves these core values in. We'll be talking about some of the Scottish Rite core values, and how those tools can help men today in society. And so let me just kind of go to the beginning here, Darin, and tell a little bit more maybe about the presentation itself and how you picked this topic. You were asked to come to the Valley of Chicago and speak. But what struck your attention to focus on this mature masculine friendship?
So I would say that the presentation is inspired by Most Worshipful Brother Bob Davis. And Bob wrote a book.
It is Understanding Manhood in America, Freemasonry's Enduring Path to the Mature Masculine.
Yes. And essentially it gave a lot of the similar points. His background is essentially in the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. And in fact, in meeting Most Worshipful Brother Davis at MasoniCon in Chicago, I was surprised to find out that he's never seen any of the Northern Masonic jurisdiction degrees, which I kind of found fascinating, but not really so, because I've never seen any of the Southern jurisdiction Scottish Rite degrees. But in any case, I had been toying around with the idea of a book about mature masculinity and Freemasonry. But after reading Most Worshipful Brother Davis's book, I just felt that his grasp on the subject was something that I wasn't going to be able to lend much more to. So when asked to come up with, to give a topic for presentation for Double Eagle Con, which was going to be Northern or Scottish Rite focused, I just, kind of put on the thinking cap, and this is what came out of that.
What interested me first about your presentation, because we were talking about this as you were putting it together, was the core values. And we had been talking about core values in Admiration chapter, which is our local Royal Arch chapter, and how those play into Freemasonry. And so, Darin, you took the 6 Scottish Rite core values, which it's ironic, good timing of us talking about this a week or so ago as we record this. The Northern Masonic jurisdiction has rolled out a new campaign. Their first one was Not Just a Man, a Mason, focused on the Blue Lodge, and their most recent campaign adds to that and talks about the Scottish Rite. But what they do in that campaign, they've produced some videos which talks about each of those Scottish Rite core values of the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. And let me just read the 6 of these, Darin, and then let's walk through each of the 6, because this is sort of how you've laid out your presentation, and you're starting to relate it to this topic of the mature masculine. Reverence for God, devotion to country, integrity, justice, tolerance, and service to humanity. And those speak to me as I hear them. The degrees are focused around them. A lot of what we do in all of Masonry can be related to those. But Darin, your first one you did get into was reverence for God. And of course, as you say in your presentation, a belief in a higher power is a prerequisite for membership. But expound on that reverence for God a little bit as you thought about your presentation, your topic.
We're taught as one of our very first lessons in our first degree that no man should undertake an undertaking without blessing a deity, right? That's one of the very first things that we learn upon our entrance to the lodge for the very first time. I think that essentially without a belief in a higher power, everything else is, I don't want to say unenforceable, but, essentially having the belief for a higher power is that cornerstone upon what these other values are built. So just being able to respect others' beliefs, having tolerance for those, and then also, just looking around and being able to appreciate what the great architect has given us on this planet, just being able to go out in nature and kind of feel that and be part of that and be one with nature. That's really, I think, the most important core value is having a belief in a higher power, however you define it, and whatever religion you subscribe to. I'm not saying that there's a correct answer for that, but what I am saying is that I personally have a belief in a higher power. I don't know how I define that, may vary day to day, but at the end of the day, I do understand that there's something at work in our universe that I cannot explain. And this feeling of awe to be able to be a part of the universe.
Yeah, I think we as human beings are programmed, wired, focused on knowing that there is something greater than ourselves. And it provides a motivation and a sense of purpose, for knowing that we aren't the only thing here, or we aren't the highest form of a being, so to speak. And that is one of the things, and I think it's why it's the first core value of what defines Freemasonry, is the fact that we have this belief in a supreme being, Darin, as you said, regardless of how we define it. And I think that's what sets us apart from so many other organizations. And there are certainly other organizations that have that as one of their core beliefs too. But I think for Freemasonry, it's fundamental. And Darin, you mentioned and you had a point in your slides, which I like. It says this allows us to slow down and truly honor and respect all of God's creations every day. That slowing down part is so important. And after 2 years of COVID and the other things that have been associated with it, I think we all need to slow down and take account for where we are, and just to be thankful. And you'll talk about, I think, more as we get into this, that slowing down and the effect that it can have on, I'm going to say, your mental health, because there's so much stress in the world today. And, the uncertainty of the last couple of years, the stress anyway, just of a modern accelerated society, we don't take that time to slow down. And I think that's one of the differences between 2022 and maybe a generation 2, 3, 4 ago. Not that they weren't busy. It's just our pace of life seems to have picked up. And part of that, if we would do, Darin, as you really have laid out here, slow down and think about all that, and maybe then put it in the context of God, really will help us in numerous ways. And so I think it's just a great point you've got there.
Yeah, thanks. I believe that I paraphrased it from, there's actually anyone can get this. There's a pamphlet that the Northern Masonic Jurisdiction came out with that is called 6 Ways to Live Our Values Every Day. And I essentially took that, it's a very small PDF, and took that and skimmed it and kind of used it to really break out from the Masonic point of view, these 6 core values and how they do relate to Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So I won't take complete credit for that statement. I think I paraphrased it.
Well, nonetheless, I think it does speak volumes. The second of these core values is integrity. And you mentioned about being honest and having moral principles. Integrity, I think, is another foundational element. Again, that's why they're core values. But that integrity, as I think about integrity, is the essence of how, you trust people. You believe in their ability to get things done. You believe in their approach when maybe they perhaps say something or, are involved with you in something. And it's again, one of those almost bedrock principles that is interwoven all throughout our fraternity and equally important, weaved in, in society. But today you observe, do you worry that so many of our public figures have lost integrity? And there could be a variety of reasons for that we don't have to get deep into, but I am concerned that we don't see our public officials, our public heroes, our public people that we look up to, and they don't have to necessarily be famous, but it seems like that lack of integrity is harder to come by. And Darin, I'd just be curious of your thoughts, not only as you put your presentation together on that topic, but what do you think about integrity in society today?
You raise a good point. I think unfortunately, the one thing with our society becoming as politicized as it is that we kind of take these buzzwords or these values like integrity and apply them to fit our belief system. So if I'm on one side, I'm going to think that my side has integrity, my side's being honest, my side has principles. And whether or not that is actually true is a different question altogether. So I think that it's very difficult in these times to define integrity. But what I will say is that what I personally believe is, and I'm paraphrasing something else, I just written a expose on Dwight Smith's Whither Are We Traveling? And one of the final points that he makes is that the men that we want to be Freemasons have the internal qualifications, and having those internal qualifications, those will reflect externally, meaning in their actions and their, not only their words, but their actions themselves. And I think that's what having integrity is that it is essentially not only saying something, but doing what you say. And I think that especially in today's society, that's a very rare trait. And I mean, to be honest, I struggle with this as well because and we're going to talk about mental health, so I'm just going to go ahead and broach the subject. I see a therapist who helps me navigate some of the issues that I'm having. And one of the things, I've discovered is that I tend to assign other people my moral code and believe that everybody kind of lives by the same moral code as I do. And one of the things that I've discovered, and obviously, a lot of people will be like, well, yeah, duh, when I say this, is that that's not the case. But for me, I really kind of felt that everybody innately had some goodness in them. And I don't honestly, unfortunately, believe that's true anymore. I believe that there are a lot of people who are just out to, for themselves, and they have no integrity. So I think having integrity it was very, very important, and, sets us as a fraternity aside, because I will say, 9 out of 10 Masons that I've met are men of integrity. There's maybe 9.9, out of 10 Masons. There's very few that I have met that I would say do not have integrity, but for the most part, they do.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. There's always, we always talk about guarding the West Gate, and we won't get into that tonight, but there's always some people, frankly, that just don't work out. And, occasionally, Darin, I think like you see that in the fraternity. Of course, as you talked about, you see it in, greater society as well. And as you've talked about, you can't assume everybody has that same level of integrity and moral code that you are striving to live up for. I think what I found the key, a part of it is that, at least in my personal philosophy, is life is too short for me to hang around people that just don't have that, or strive to have that moral code. It doesn't mean that others won't come across or you won't interface with them at some point in your life, but those that you choose to spend time with. Because to me, time is the most valuable commodity I have because it's so limited. I'm going to strive to be with people that are working on those same paths that I am. And I think what that does is it rubs off on you in a good way so that, me and others, all of us try to strive to do better. And I think a lot of the projects, Darin, you and I worked on in the fraternity, that's been kind of the core, whether we knew it or not. We may not have said that, but I think I've watched both of us grow to be better people just because of, I think, the integrity that we're all trying to, live up to and learn more about and try to illustrate with not only within the fraternity, but certainly within the outside world too. So I think it's a great thing. And I've seen, of course, you grow. And, so even if everyone doesn't have that certain moral code or integrity that, you could assume that they should, I think the benefit of the fraternity is we find an awful lot of people that we can be around that do. And so that's a positive thing. The next one you had was justice. And justice, immediately when I say it, what comes to my mind, of course, is the lady holding the scales of justice, and how they are balanced. And you say in the presentation that justice is closely related to integrity. And justice, we hear a lot about justice in the world today. That could be justice as in law and order. It could be social justice, which we're trying, as people try to have equal rights and things like that. You also say in your presentation, striving to live a life unwavering integrity allows us to see what is fair and reasonable. And that, again, I think is a foundational element of justice because, one person's justice may, the definition of that may depend from one person to the next. But I think as we, further bring in that topic of integrity, that it becomes clearer over time, if that's how you're trying to live your life, what is justice. Doesn't mean there won't be a disagreement on something, but justice becomes much clearer. And so, Darin, how do you see integrity with the justice of those two interrelating more specifically?
So I think that essentially what justice is, and I use this in my slide as applying fairness without contingencies provides moral clarity, imbues empathy, and increases internal contentment. I think that living a just life is that being able to know what is fair and what is reasonable, and striving for that in your inner dealings with other people. And, in Freemasonry, we talk about, being on the square and being on the level with our brethren. And I kind of think that is, when you think about that being on the level, you think about those two scales that are, perfectly balanced. And that to me is kind of what I see justice as it's a personal, obviously we have the justice system, or as you said, there's a social justice, but at the end of the day, the justice really is how you interact with others and how making sure that your social interactions are essentially fair.
You go on to the next core value, which is tolerance. And tolerance, you say in your presentation, America was built on religious, political, and social tolerance. It's difficult to be tolerant when faced with someone who opposes your own strong personal beliefs. But using the tools of Freemasonry, we can choose tolerance as moral virtue instead of dismissing or getting defensive when opposing beliefs or lifestyles are presented to us. Especially as I think about that third sentence, and I go back to the other things we just talked about justice and integrity and reverence for God. You're weaving those in there again. And we were saying earlier, it's like slow down and take your time and appreciate what you got. That's not exactly how we said it, but that's what we're saying. And when I think about tolerance in today's society, there's definitely a lack of tolerance, but most of the time I see it as people being dismissive. They immediately have to take either this side or that side and can't see this middle ground. They get their news, as we've talked in other episodes, from social media, and they may tend to, be tribalized where they're, you're either on that team or this team or with that candidate or this candidate. And we have lost our ability to really be tolerant of one another. And tolerant to me includes listening to one another, being patient with one another, understanding that you may not have all the answers, being open-minded and willing to listen to that other person, to learn from that other person. And I think if you go into conversations and just your day-to-day life, you're going to learn a whole lot more if you'll just let yourself. Because I know I've certainly thought I knew a lot about certain topics, but I'm like, well, I want to learn something different. And I've actually had my mind changed on things. And I'm glad I did, because I think that's part of the growth of a human being, and is learning from one another. But tolerance, Darin, tell me some more about tolerance.
Yeah, that's the buzzword of today, right? Because I think, for as much as I say here that America was built on religious, political, and social tolerance, there's also a lot of intolerance based upon those three things. So I think that what tolerance requires is critical thinking. And as you said, Greg, not to be so siloed in your thinking because of your disposition politically, religiously, socially, et cetera, et cetera. I think that what breaks my heart the most about Freemasonry is seeing brothers at each other's throats on social media because of the things that we do not discuss in lodge. And I very rarely on my social media make political statements just because we were talking earlier about, having energy and, other people's impacts on that, and not having a lot of time for people that are, I guess, toxic for lack of a better term. And that's, what tolerance is to me is being able to listen to another viewpoint. But also, I think it's very difficult for people to not get defensive when somebody questions their belief system. And so tolerance to me is getting to a point where you can have discussions about delicate matters in a calm way without any of those negative emotions like, anger or being defensive. Unfortunately, as you said it, and I'll use one of my favorite Masonic words, inculcated. Many people have been inculcated to, believe that X person must be bad because they belong to Y political party, or X person must be bad because they worship Y God, and so on and so forth. And that combating ignorance, I think, is, and I don't really say it in this slide, but I think combating that type of ignorance is also part of trying to spread tolerance, because you can't teach somebody to be tolerant if they're ignorant.
Totally agree. I go back to my, statement about time is my most valuable commodity. And if you're just such a toxic person, it's not that I won't respect you or try not to, I will understand that you may have different beliefs, but when you get to the toxicity level, I'm probably just going to move on, because there's so many other people I can interface with that, whether they believe what I do or not, I can learn from them, and I'll spend my time with them. So, devotion to country. Now, hey, this is one of my favorite ones. Darin knows that I love flags and I love parades. And of course, we were in the Boy Scouts together and all that stuff. And that's one of, I think, one of the most funnest parts of Freemasonry is devotion to country. And you say Masons are among the most patriotic citizens, but devotion to country is not just about being patriotic. It is standing up for the rights of our fellow Masons and citizens. And I think, Darin, you just hit it there, that as much as I love flags, and there's always a flag either at my house and on our farm flying 24/7, that flag is a symbol of more than just the cloth that is made up within that flag. It really is, and it's more than, it is the foundational freedoms that perhaps our Constitution stands for and many of these other things. But it also goes back to, I think, where we're talking about tolerance and justice and integrity, standing up for the rights of our fellow Masons and citizens. And part of that, again, is that ability, even if I don't perhaps agree with your particular statement on maybe its policy or beliefs or whatever, I think standing up for your right to believe those, at least especially in our democracy, is foundational. And we, one of the things about Freemasonry is we don't teach you how to think. We teach you hopefully to think, but we don't teach you what to think or how to think. We encourage you to be a student of the craft. But part of that is defending others or standing up for others' rights. And Darin, you also talked about practicing civics, and that's, for me, that's a big one. I've talked several times about Freemasonry as a microcosm of democracy when you have your monthly stated meeting. And again, take that meeting as an example. You are exercising a democratic process to approve a budget, or maybe you're voting in a new member, or whatever the case is, and you may have some debate over it, and the debate could have one side, two sides, three sides, or more. At the end of it, you're trying to compromise because you believe your fellow Freemasons are people of integrity, and you are trying to come up with a joint solution. But part of it is you're standing up for their rights to speak in lodge about the topic. And again, that may seem like a very simple example, but we look at what's going on in the Ukraine today as we record this. There's people standing up for their country and their rights to have a democracy. And so Freemasonry, one of the interesting things I've heard several times is the only place Freemasonry is not expanding is in places we already have these democratic governments, but in areas in the world that don't have the freedoms that we do in this country, the Masons are growing there because people see what they stand for, and this is one of those principles I think that they're trying to utilize. So devotion to country, Darin, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it's any accident that so many of the framers of the Constitution and our Bill of Rights were Freemasons, because you see Freemasonry essentially was and is a democratic system. We won't go into the ills of progressive lines, but essentially there are, in each Masonic lodge every year, there is an election for the three main officers of that lodge, plus the secretary and treasurer. So, we have these positions that are elected, and as long as you are a Master Mason, you can run for any of those positions. And I think that we see these Masonic themes deeply ingrained in the documents that founded our country, because of those men that were standing up at that time to Great Britain, and King George had learned a lot, I think, probably about democracy from seeing it in action in their own Masonic lodges. So I don't think that it's any accident that happens. I think that, my third point, practicing civics, I think that is the best way that one can be devoted to their country, being, practicing their ability to vote and participating in civic minded activities, like you mentioned, the parades, which we still do in our little town of St. Joe. I think that those are key in just kind of showing that even in 2022, that the Masonic fraternity is about those things that we talk about in our Bill of Rights, that all men are created equal, and that they do have inalienable rights.
Yeah, I agree. It's that time in our history of the United States would have been so fascinating to be the fly on the wall as the founding fathers had those discussions, either in a lodge meeting or, in the Continental Congress, where they were, debating putting together the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, later, after the American Revolution, the Constitution and all the things that went into it, and then the things that didn't go into it. And then, of course, they later added the Bill of Rights, which contained the first 10 amendments, and then we've added several since then. The next core value, and number 6 of the 6 we're talking about tonight, is service to humanity. And it's just, again, as we go through these, you just see the link from this one to this one to this one to this one. Darin says on Service to Humanity, it is the very nature of the Masonic fraternity to live, to serve our brethren and communities. It is taking time to share, teach, mentor a new Mason, and lead by example. The first sentence, Darin, it is the very nature of Masonic fraternity to live and serve our brethren and communities. What I've long said, one of my major purposes as I see the fraternity, as I learn things within it, either in a lodge meeting or in the Scottish Rite or the York Rite or any other appendant body, is all those tools that I'm learning is to take back out into the community. And Darin, you mentioned being involved in civics, whether that's voting or maybe you're participating in your local government or the Chamber of Commerce or whatever, is taking those tools we learn inside and taking them back outside to have that positive effect on our communities and the people that live within it. The second point you make, which I think is one of the most important in this whole presentation, and it'll lead into really more of the masculine discussion we'll have, is mentoring a new Mason, leading by example. I know you'll talk about it, but there's the lack of the male role model today is just so, I think, impactful on what our society, the direction we've gone. And I don't think of that in a positive way. So here's an example of why I think it's important. Recently, my college fraternity emailed everybody that was on their email list and said, we have started a new program that is asking alumni to mentor undergraduate students in our fraternity. And I thought about it and I go, I should do that. So I signed up, and it's asking you, who you are and what's your background and this, that, and the other. And it came to one question that really struck me. It says, well, why do you want to do this? And I sat and thought about it for a minute, and I thought, well, and instantly in my mind came pictures of 4 or 5 alumni from when I was in school, and our fraternity was very new. It had just started not very many years before I was in. And these alumni were not even graduates of the university I attended, but they were so devoted to the fraternity because they wanted to make us better people. And as I thought about them, I thought, they gave us so much, and it just seemed the right thing to do for me to try to give a little bit about what they gave me to the people coming after me. And in Freemasonry specifically, the mentoring aspect is one of the biggest ways I think that you learn what the fraternity means, and to teach it to those that not only come after you, but they're maybe even there before you. Because mentoring doesn't mean it's somebody that follows you. You could be a mentor to somebody that's already been in the fraternity and you learn from them, but it's taking the time to listen and share and teach, as you say in your slide. But I think we don't do enough of that. Some of it we do intentionally, some of it we do unintentionally. But I think if we did more of the mentoring, not only would we do a lot of other things better, but the impact Freemasonry has on the outside world could be even more impactful. So, Darin, I'm going to ask you to talk about service to humanity and really let you go ahead and transition into the mature masculine, because really it feeds right into some of the rest of the points you made in this great presentation.
Okay. So, service to humanity, I think is easily summed up in the third point on this particular value that I made, and that it's actively applying our Masonic values in everyday life. So it's living, our not only the core values that we have talked about previously in this episode, but all of the Masonic tenets that we are taught in the Blue Lodge. I know you wanted me to kind of go ahead and talk about mature masculinity, but the next point before we get there that I make is essentially that that male friendships in decline, and that some key indicators of that are that there was a survey taken in 1990 and then another one taken in 2021, and these questions were asked. And the percentage of men without any close friends jumped from 3% in 1990 to 15% in 2021. The percentage of men with only one close friend doubled from 3% to 6% in the same time frame. And then conversely, 40% of men in 1990 said that they had more than 10 close friends. This percentage dropped to 15% in 2021. And what I say is that major male friendships in decline for three reasons. The first reason is social isolation. A lot of men don't have any non-virtual social outlets. So their opportunities to meet other men outside of their workplace are essentially very rare, right? Then lack of role models or mentors, that many men grew up in broken homes and or lacking any positive male role models to learn from. And then lastly, socialization, which I think is also a big topic, especially for, I would say, probably boomers and Gen X. I don't know millennial if it applies as much, but essentially, you know, when you grew up, Greg, when I grew up, we were socialized into believing that, you know, if you kind of went up to another guy and just started talking to them, that you might come off as weak or, you know, feminine or whatever. So I think that, you know, we have had this idea of what a man should be kind of hammered into our head through Hollywood, through, you know, media, through advertising, all these different channels that we're bombarded as kind of leads to why male friendship is in decline. And the impacts of that are great because it directly impacts mental health. Essentially, if you don't have a friend that you can share your emotions with, your feelings with, you end up becoming more angry, irritable, aggressive. And there's actually a psychiatric diagnosis called normative male alexithymia, and that's the inability of men to put emotions into words. And this is essentially because of them being socialized to not, you know, express their feelings and to, you know, conform to traditional masculine norms. So essentially we have had years of men being taught that they need to be strong, resilient, independent, and emotionally inexpressive, and that these, you know, that showing emotion, having empathy, having, you know, loving one another is you know, weak, and these are feminine qualities. You're not a real man if you feel this way. So essentially what occurs is that you have these men that are become isolated, depressed, and have no outlet for their emotions. And what ends up happening, the very worst possible scenario, is that they commit suicide. And the numbers that I use in my presentation are pre-pandemic. I don't know that they've come out with the study for post-pandemic. At least I've not found it. But in 2019, the average rate of suicide was 13.93 per 100,000 individuals. And this rate of suicide was highest in middle-aged white men, which they classified as 45 to 64. And that men died by suicide almost 4 times more than women, 3.63 times greater. And white males accounted for 69.38% of suicide deaths in 2019, which is essentially, for the lodges in our neck of the woods, most of our lodges are made up of this demographic, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what essentially I say is that men need friendship with other men to keep them emotionally grounded and give them support from their own life experiences. And that's when, we talk about mentorship, which we'll talk about here briefly. But that men need these friendships with other men to counter these feelings of depression, anxiety, and isolation. They need to be able to talk to other guys about, what they're going through. And then I kind of talk about the types of friendship. Aristotle categorized 3 types of friendship. Friendships of utility, which is essentially between you and somebody who's useful to you in some way. Friendship of pleasure, those exist between you and those other people that kind of share maybe the same hobbies or that you do. And then the friendship for the good, which are the friendships that are based on mutual respect, admiration for each other's virtues, and a strong desire to aid and assist the other person because you recognize their essential goodness. And I ask in my presentation of the audience for show of hands if any of them have a friendship of the good. And then I ask them how many of those friends that are friendships of the good, how many of those friendships are with Freemasons. Usually it's a very high number. And then I ask, why do they think that is? And that's because most Freemasons are men that are mature in their masculinity. What I define mature masculinity is a core which calls each man to reveal and manifest the full meaning of his masculinity, which is his potential. It requires them to claim the wisdom, beauty, and strength that's hiding inside of them. And by choosing this path, men adhere to these values, which are similar to the values of the Northern Masonic jurisdiction, Scottish Rite. So there's accountability, authenticity, compassion, generosity, integrity, leadership, multicultural awareness, and respect. So accountability, you take sole responsibility for your action, thoughts, and feeling. Authenticity, you tell the truth about who you are and you strive to be your best self. Compassion, you empathize, connect to the suffering of others, and act with love towards the world. Generosity, you recognize the giving of yourself from your abundance brings more for all. You take on missions of service in the world and work together with others to make a positive difference. Integrity, you live your values and seek wholeness within yourself and the world. Leadership, you step forward to offer compassionate leadership, seeking understanding and community rather than domination or oppression. Multicultural awareness, you recognize that in our world it is imperative to live in harmony with those who are different than ourselves. You strive to understand yourself and others and celebrate your differences. Respect. You pay attention to the impact of your actions on others and you treat others with honor. And so essentially I take those core values of mature masculinity and I map them to the core values of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which, accountability I wrap to reverence for God and justice. Authenticity I equated to integrity and justice. Compassion I mapped to reverence for God and justice. Generosity, reverence for God, service to humanity. Integrity and justice. Leadership, devotion to country and justice. Multicultural awareness, tolerance, and devotion to country. And then for respect, I put all of the values of the Scottish Rite because I really feel that without having all of those, you cannot have respect for others. So then I argue that your mature masculine friendship is going to be a friendship for the good. If you both believe and practice the core values that I just laid out, you're going to have the mutual respect for each other. You're going to have admiration for each other's virtues, and you're going to have that strong desire to aid and assist that other person due to their essential goodness.
So let me stop you there. Early on, as you started to describe this, you talked about, societal's expectations of men essentially to be, emotionless and the manly man and all that, and made me think of my grandfather, my dad's dad. And growing up, he was, we'd go over to their house and he was, this gruff guy. And, it's like, I was almost kind of scared of him and this, that, and the other. And when he, in my 20s, as he was, towards the end of his life, we were in the hospital and he was towards the end. And he was laying there in his bed. He was very tall man. He's like 6'2", very strong. He was a laborer by his profession and had, worked outside, and he literally had a third grade education. And he'd always had this, kind of tough guy thing going. And I think a lot of it was because of his upbringing. But at the end, it's funny, as we were in that hospital room, he knew he wasn't going to make it. And I'll never forget it. I was holding his hand and saw this tear come from his eyes, because he couldn't move much by then. And it's like in a flash, I just saw all that veneer disappear. And I realized, how much of that was just probably a societal expectation. I don't think I realized it maybe till years down the road, but as I have thought about that more than once, I could just see it, that's what his generation, that World War II generation, and he was a veteran, had expected of him. And I just saw in a flash the difference. And then later, as my grandmother would tell me stories of, him courting her, and I learned more, and I just saw that, that toughness wasn't really him. It may have been a piece of him, but there was just so much more to him. And I just think there's so many other men like that, their time and age didn't allow them to get to show the emotions that were healthy. I think that's an important point here. Emotions are natural and they're healthy. And when they're bottled up inside, they cause issues, to be frank. And I think as society has evolved over time, and we allow men to have more emotions, I think it's good. Darin, I think what you also hit on, though, was at the same time that's happening is that more men are isolated. So it's like, you talk about that balance, whereas, you could be more open, but yet at the same time, we're more isolated. And I think your point about how many friends do you really have? Well, I, think back, and I'm lucky I should have lots of friends, but they're probably fewer now. And a lot of that's because I don't see them. Maybe that's just because you get older and have kids and all that. But I also think part of it is just because we have become more isolated as a society. And then the last 2 years, as we've talked about more than once, have accelerated that isolationism. And Darin, you made a point, your stats you were quoting were pre-COVID, and it will be interesting to see when the new numbers come out. I would predict there's been an increase in it. And I don't say that with anything that I would want to see an increase in numbers, but the reality is it probably is, which I think leads to one of the important points of what the fraternity can do. And that's where we were talking about that mentoring. And Darin, you talked about it in the presentation we did that night, was intentional mentoring and unintentional mentoring. And both are of extreme value, because I think if you have a mentor as somebody you can talk with, it helps bring down these walls. I think it's a very positive thing that, it doesn't have to be an emotional discussion. It's just the fact that you can talk through issues. And again, as we spoke about earlier, as you talk through those issues, the understanding that you gain, perhaps even from your own insight, not just that the person you're talking to, they may agree or disagree with you. Sometimes it just doesn't even matter. Just the fact that you have the ability to talk through a situation or an issue or a topic with somebody helps you drill down, and, I think helps you focus and, lowers your blood pressure, brings that stress level down, because those are all the things we're seeing. And certainly I see it in higher education where I work. We talk about mental health a lot more. And so a lot of it is, to Darin's topic here, is the isolationism that we're facing, men in particular, and how we can address some of that in a fraternity. Darin, I want you to talk about mentoring if you can, what you've seen with it, how you think the fraternity could do a different job, better job, innovative job. What's your thoughts?
So essentially, in wrapping up the presentation, I talk about how these mature masculine friendships create a relationship that I call a friend tour. And I know it's a corny term, but this is essentially where you have friends that serve as mentors for each other. And mentorship mentorship is usually thought of as someone older with more experience mentoring somebody younger with less experience. But and what I found is mentorship is a relationship, right? It is, as you said, it is having those, just being able to have those discussions and learning from each other. And it doesn't really matter if the mentor is younger or older. It's just that relationship where you're both providing each other guidance, knowledge, you're motivating each other, you're coaching each other, you're giving each other emotional support, you're serving as role models for each other. But most importantly, I think, is when you are a mentor, is that the hope is that you create other mentors. And that's the point I get to in the end of my presentation, is that the goal of Freemasonry shouldn't be to take good men and make them better, because we have this tried and true thing. We need to take good men and we make them better. Well, that's fine and dandy, but what we need to be doing is we need to be taking these good men and we need to be teaching them how to be mature masculine mentors for other men. And if we can teach this mentoring skill, and if we can go out in our community and seek out these other men that I've shown are isolated and our need mentorship, that's where we can make our deepest impact in the world. So it's, in my mind, incumbent upon us to find these opportunities to mentor other individuals, be them in your Masonic lodge or outside your Masonic lodge. But ideally, they would be outside the Masonic lodge so that you can show, what our lodge values are about, what we do in lodge, what type of men we are. And I really think that in order to do so, we have to be active in your communities, and you have to be active in supporting Masonic and non-Masonic youth organizations. And both you and I, Greg, were scout leaders, and it's been a pleasure of mine, I know, as yours as well, to see a lot of these young men that we knew grow up into manhood and, go off to college and be respectable members of society. There's a young man, Eric Roth, that both Greg and I know, and he had his Eagle ceremony, invited all of his leaders from the past. And it was I really got emotional seeing, he had a slideshow kind of showing his journey through scouting. And it was really emotional for me to see, the impact that we had on this young man. Because I don't think that when you are being an adult leader or a mentor that you really think about that impact. You hope that you're having an impact, but I don't think that you're doing it for that. I think you do it because somewhere in mentoring these young men, it helps you learn about yourself as well. And like I said, that mentoring is a relationship. And I think that, even young men have things that they can teach us crusty old guys, right? So at the end of the day, if we are able to positively impact other men's lives and do this by exemplifying the core values of Scottish Rite Freemasonry and Freemasonry in general, we are hopefully going to inspire some of these men to join Freemasonry. And also, and I think if we're able to do that, we're creating a better, corner of our world. We leave our legacy and hopefully imparting these values, even if for some reason Freemasonry were to wither and die, that these values would live on.
Yeah, to kind of wrap it up, let me give a sort of an analogy or a metaphor. I don't know what it would be. Maybe I'm not that sophisticated on this, but I had a Facebook memory pop up today. And ironically, I remember a few years ago, I went down to Belleville, Illinois, and I was retrieving some costumes and things for our new Royal Arch chapter. And I was in Belleville, and in downtown, I think it must have been across the street from the lodge, there was this little house, and there was a sign out back. And so, okay, it got my curiosity, and I walked across the street and to see what the sign said. And in essence, what it said was, men of today, or man today, or person of today, may plant an acorn, and that acorn will sprout into a tree and cast shade that the person who planted it will never get to see the benefit of. And I just think that analogy was just so almost everything we've talked about in this last hour, that you're planting the seed today, and you're doing that through living those core values that we talked about. You're doing that through becoming a mentor. You're doing that being involved in your community and all of that. And that person you may grow may do that with another person and another person. And so you may not see the net full result of your effort, but you've certainly planted that seed or that acorn that are going to have a big impact down the road. And so that's, Darin, I think as I was thinking about this, that was just a picture in my mind I couldn't get away from as you described the end here. So any parting comments, Darin, you want to give as we wrap up?
So yes, mentoring is, I believe, the goal of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, Masonry in general.
Well, we appreciate everybody listening to this episode 45, Mature Masculine Friendship. Take a minute, go out and plant an acorn with somebody in your lodge. Watch them grow, and you never know, they may become the next Grand Master of Freemasonry. They may become a mentor, more importantly, to somebody else that'll help that person grow. So stay tuned again here down the road for another exciting episode of Meet, Act, and Part, and we appreciate everybody listening tonight.
Thank you for listening to Meet, Act, and Part. For more information about our show, visit our website at www.meetactandpart.com. While there, please consider supporting the show by sponsoring us on Patreon. Until we meet again, may we meet, act, and part.